Start your day with Morning Edition and wind it down with All Things Considered, only on KPBS. From global headlines to local stories, stay informed, inspired, and connected. Tune in daily or listen anytime at kpbs.org.
Welcome in, San Diego. It's Jade Hindman. On today's show, how to protect our First Amendment rights. This is KPBS Midday Edition, connecting our communities through conversation. So last week, former CNN anchor and independent journalist Don Lemon and independent journalist Georgia Fort were arrested by federal agents weeks after covering an anti-ICE protest in Minnesota. They were among now 6 people arrested. A federal grand jury in Minnesota indicted them on charges related to interruption of a religious service at a church. Well, on Friday, they were released from custody. But it really raises the question, what do these arrests signal about press freedom and the First Amendment in the current political moment? Well, joining me is David Loy, legal director of the First Amendment Coalition. David, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's always great to have you on. To start this conversation, I want to play a clip from a live-streamed video Georgia Fort posted on Facebook. She said federal agents were at her door to take her into custody. This was moments before her arrest.
I don't feel like I have my First Amendment right as a member of the press because now federal agents are at my door arresting me for filming the church protest a few weeks ago. Again, I don't have a long time here, you guys, but I wanted you to know, for me, agents are at my door right now. It's hard to understand how we have a constitution, constitutional rights, when you can just be arrested for being a member of the press.
Mm-hmm. So Lemon and Fort were both covering this protest as independent journalists. First, can you break down their First Amendment rights as members of the press?
The First Amendment absolutely guarantees the right to cover the news, report the news, and engage in journalism on matters of public concern, which is exactly what this protest was.
Mm-hmm. And were you surprised to hear about their arrest?
I was appalled.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, I can't say I'm surprised by anything that this administration does anymore. And that's not a political comment. That's a comment on this administration's relentless assault on the Constitution and rule of law. So I find it appalling, but sadly not surprising. The current president and members of the administration have been on a rampage against the press, especially reporters who cover them with any form of critical detachment. And they perceive or appear to perceive any form of critical coverage as, an attack or a crime, which is absolutely not correct under the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects, above all else, the right to report the news and criticize the government.
So, absolutely. They were both independent journalists, as mentioned earlier. Does that make them more vulnerable to arrests like these and government pressure, you think?
Legally, no. Practically, perhaps. So legally, everyone who covers the news and everyone who comments on the news, be it a reporter or member of the public, is equally protected by the First Amendment. As a practical matter, I don't think it's a coincidence that this administration is targeting independent journalists who lack the institutional support of major media organizations. That being said, I should note that the government did serve a search warrant on the home of a Washington Post reporter. Mm-hmm. So obviously, reporters who work for legacy media are not immune or exempt.
Yeah. Justice Department officials, initially, they failed to secure a warrant against Lemon twice until this case went to a grand jury. Can you break down the legal strategy at play here?
So the charges against Lemon and Fort are for allegedly violating and conspiring to violate a federal statute called the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, which covers or prohibits interference with access to both reproductive health facilities and places of worship. To report the news, however, is not the same as to commit a crime. If we assume potentially that some persons violated the FACE Act by the protest that they staged at this church in Minnesota, and I'll assume that without necessarily agreeing with it, the fact that Don Lemon and Georgia Fort were simply present and reporting that news does not mean they committed the crime of physical interference with a place of worship. The statute is very clear. It's not just any protest at a clinic or place of worship. It requires, physical interference, i.e. preventing people from restricting their freedom of movement. It requires physical obstruction, which means making it impossible to get in and out of the church or facility, or at least making it unreasonably difficult or hazardous to get in and out. And it also prohibits intimidation, which means to place a person in reasonable apprehension of bodily harm to themselves or another. So a mere protest at a church, whatever one thinks of that, does not rise to the level of a violation of this federal statute on its face. Now, and even if some of the people that were engaged in this protest did cross the line into physical obstruction, intimidation, or physical interference, the mere fact that reporters are there present covering that and streaming it does not mean that the reporters are committing the crime. The statute contains an express carve-out, as it must, for any activity protected by the First Amendment. And the First Amendment protects the right to report the news on matters of public concern, which this clearly is.
Is there any precedent for the FACE Act actually being used against journalists?
I have never heard of such a thing. I think the entire press freedom community was shocked to hear this and appalled, and there's been numerous letters protesting this, numerous calls to the government to drop this case against the reporters because it's an unprecedented assault on freedom of speech and freedom of the press to say that reporting the news is a crime. Journalism is not a crime. Reporting the news is not a crime. Sometimes reporters do cover the actions of third parties who may potentially be committing a crime, but that is in the public interest to protect the rights of the reporters to cover the news and inform the public about matters of public concern, which this clearly is.
And even beyond journalists, protesting is not a crime. Talk a bit about that, because the label domestic terrorist has been thrown around a lot to describe any voice of opposition to this current administration.
That is correct. This administration has thrown that epithet around quite a bit, and it's an immensely dangerous and appalling thing to say, to characterize people exercising their rights to protest as domestic terrorists. That is not the language of a democracy and a language of a country governed by a constitution. That's the language of an authoritarian dictator, to demonize any opposition as so-called domestic terrorism. Potentially, sometimes people who engage in protests may sometimes potentially commit minor crimes, such as trespass or obstructing an officer. Potentially, that depends on the facts. But the mere commission, even if we assume that there's some minor crime being committed in the course of an otherwise lawful protest, that does not remotely rise to the level of so-called terrorism. And it is immensely dangerous to demonize one's opponents, one's political opponents, with that kind of authoritarian language.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this. Could local prosecutors pursue similar charges, the FACE Act charges against journalists covering protests in the state of California?
They should not. The FACE Act is a federal statute, so it's prosecutable by federal officials. Mm-hmm. There are, I'm sure, if we assume that someone broke into a church or entered a church and physically threatened the pastor or the priest or members of the congregation, if that happened, pulled out a gun, threatened to hurt people, stop them from going in and out, I'm sure that violates any number of other state criminal laws in addition to the FACE Act. We have laws against assault. We have laws against true threats to cause harm. We have laws against restraint of movement. We have laws against stopping people from going in and out of public places like churches. So if someone were to commit those acts and actually do those things, yes, potentially that's a state or federal crime. But again, simply being present as a reporter and covering those events does not make you a criminal. A reporter is not an accomplice to a crime because the reporter is simply reporting the news.
True. The federal government, though, they did it. They filed charges, made arrests. Could local prosecutors do something similar if they wanted to?
Any law enforcement agency can potentially abuse the law and stretch the law beyond what it's supposed to cover. So there have been instances of local law enforcement abusing the law against journalists. I'll give you two examples. One is in California and one was not. In California several years ago, San Francisco police obtained a search warrant for the home and work product of a reporter named Brian Carmody. And the allegation was that he was in possession of information that was relevant to the investigation into the death of Jeff Adachi, the former San Francisco public defender. California law expressly prohibits police from asking for or judges from issuing search warrants against reporters. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, the police apparently missed that memo. So did the judges who signed the warrants. And they literally broke down his door and searched his home and took his equipment. And the advocacy community, the press freedom community, mobilized immediately, including but not limited to my organization, the First Amendment Coalition, and fought back early, hard, and fast. And eventually that was resolved, but it should never have happened in the first place. There was also an instance in Kansas. I believe the Marion County Record was a newspaper in Kansas where police served a search warrant on the newspaper based on a bogus allegation that they had violated some state law while conducting their reporting. And again, that's a subject of current litigation. A number of claims have been settled. Again, there was an immediate outcry. The police backed off. The prosecutors backed off. That's still in litigation. That's just two examples. So yes, it does happen. Abuses of press freedom, violations of press freedom do happen at the state and local level as well as the federal level. I will say this federal administration is notoriously relentless about it. The situation, for example, the Brian Carmody warrant is an exception to the rule. It should never have happened. And I think it's been well recognized that was an absolute outrage. But it's very much the exception, not the rule. Whereas this administration seems to make it the rule, not the exception, to attack civil rights and civil liberties across the board.
Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about legal observers, or people who are at protests, who are filming ICE raids and whatnot. What is within their constitutional rights here?
The First Amendment absolutely guarantees the right to observe, document, and record events of public concern in public places, including but not limited to the actions of law enforcement. One is obligated to maintain a reasonably safe distance. One cannot physically interfere with law enforcement operations, physically obstruct, physically prevent them, but one does have the absolute First Amendment right to observe, document, and record the conduct of law enforcement in a public place.
What do you see as the implications of these arrests, not just on journalists and protesters, but for everyone's First Amendment rights?
It's terrifying. These arrests are designed to send a message to deter and chill people from covering the news, from opposing this administration. And it's not just this incident with the Don Lemon and Georgia Ford arrest and the arrests of other people in this church. I mean, the federal government has called people terrorists for simply protesting and documenting the conduct of law enforcement. They've claimed it's illegal to, quote unquote, dox law enforcement agents by simply recording their activities in a public place. We do not have secret police in this country. Authoritarian dictatorships have secret police. We should not have secret police in this country. If law enforcement officers are carrying out their duties in a public place, they do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy and not being documented and observed. The courts have repeatedly held there is a First Amendment right to observe, document, and record the activities of law enforcement in a public place. And if we didn't have video of abuses that were committed, we would not have evidence when these things happen. Not all officers commit these kinds of abuses. Many officers do understand and respect the First Amendment and have no problem being recorded because they know that they're doing their job and they're fine with the people knowing it.
Let me ask you this. Slapping the label of domestic terrorist on protesters and anyone in opposition, it's more than just about putting the label on someone. Doesn't that open people up to surveillance?
It should not, but it is designed to threaten, intimidate, and chill people. Right? There is no one-size-fits-all federal domestic terrorism statute. Mm-hmm. There are specific laws that prohibit certain kinds of crimes designed to intimidate. Right? And so, yes, if I blow up a building, and make political demands because I blow up a building, potentially that's a terrorism charge. But reporting the news, engaging in protest, even if that protest is angry and vehement, the First Amendment guarantees the right to oppose the government, and the government should never be surveilling people or threatening them simply for exercising their rights to freedom of speech and protest and dissent.
And quickly, how do you encourage people to familiarize themselves with their rights, and how can we protect them?
So there are any number of Know Your Rights resources. My office has some on our website, the ACLU and others can educate people on their rights. I will say, the First Amendment is like anything else. Use it or lose it. If you ignore your rights, they will go away. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in civil society to stand up for the Constitution and rule of law. This is not a partisan political question. There are any number of Republicans who are just as concerned about abuses of rule of law by this administration.
I've been speaking with David Loy, Legal Director of the First Amendment Coalition. We'll link to those resources on our page, kpbs.org. David, as always, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. I'm your host, Jade Hindman. Thanks for tuning in to Midday Edition. Be sure to have a great day on purpose, everyone.
Powerful people can abuse their position, and the community expects them to be held accountable. That's where the KPBS investigations team comes in. If you have a tip for us, send an email to investigations@kpbs.org or message on the Signal app at 619-594-8177.